My name is Roger Buck, and today we're going to be talking about the Anglosphere, which is to say the English-speaking region of the world that I inhabit, and I imagine most of my viewers also inhabit. And we're also going to be talking about the great Hilaire Belloc, who, among so many other things, it seems to me, had an acute understanding of the role of English-speaking culture in the world and the kind of pitfalls and prejudices that it often falls into. Because, friends, that is what I'm mainly here to talk about. That we Americans, we English, often fall into so many unconscious prejudices. Before I go on, and explain what I mean, let me just say right now that I am both English and American. In fact, one of my little jokes about myself is that I'm an Englishman from Los Angeles. My parents were British, but I was brought up on the American West Coast. So sometimes I think of myself as a sort of quintessential Anglo-American. I've lived in both cultures, I know them well. And what I've seen over the years, particularly since I became a Catholic convert, and particularly since I went to go and live in Catholic cultures like France and Spain, is that we English, we Americans, really do fall into quite significant traps. I'll give you a little example, just a little one, of what I'm getting at here right now. A few years ago, I was looking at a Wikipedia article, almost certainly written by a British person, and he was writing about a situation of an Anglican church in the British Isles, and he said something like this. Well, back then, back in the past, this Anglican church belonged to the Roman Catholic Church, which was then the mainstream church in the world. Something like that. And it's really extraordinary. Only an Anglo-American person could write a sentence like that. Because, friends, there's never been a time when the Catholic Church has not been the mainstream church in the world. Catholicism is still, by far, the dominant form of Christianity across the planet. Protestant churches only account for something like 30% of global Christianity. And yet, if you're in the Anglosphere, you can actually think that the Protestant church is maybe the mainstream church. It doesn't occur to you that actually Catholicism has never stopped being the mainstream church in the world because you're so caught up in your English-speaking culture. That's just a small example of what I mean. Now, all this has enormous ramifications, enormous consequences, but very often they're quite subtle. One of the things I hope to get to in this video is how Belloc saw very, very subtle things that actually had enormous power. But I'm going to try, before we get to Belloc, I'm going to try and say something from my own life. As I've said on these videos, I am a convert from the New Age movement. Now, the New Age movement claims to be something universal, to represent a kind of universal spirituality, and I bought into that for many, many years. It's only after I sort of stepped into the Catholic world and also went to places like France and Spain to live, where I saw the New Age hardly exists at all in comparison to the way it exists in England and America. It's only after that I really saw how much, not only how much the New Age is an Anglo-American phenomenon, but how it naturally grows out of the Protestant culture in those countries. I hope to expand that. And it's also paradoxically a reaction to Protestantism. And I would say it's a reaction to Protestantism because New Agers like myself have, and I had, no idea about the other half of the sky, or the other 70% of the sky. So my figures are quite approximate here, but very roughly, um, Catholicism on a global level is nearing 60% of global Christianity, and then you factor in Orthodoxy, and you've got something going on for another 10%. That's approximately the case. And living in the Anglo-American culture, I had no idea that global Christianity was dominated by Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. I had no idea what a sacrament was. I had no idea what a mass was, or what a priest was. Not really. I would have just assumed unconsciously that he was some kind of Protestant minister who, through some sort of sexual hang-up, couldn't get married. I would have had no idea, because the English-speaking culture was always influencing me. And when I thought of what Christianity was, I thought mainly of evangelical Christianity. That's what I saw around me. That's what I assumed, I think unconsciously, was the mainstream form of Christianity. And I think the same is true of all kinds of New Agers, not just me. The vast majority of the New Agers that I met while I was involved in the movement were English and American people out of the Anglosphere who were seeing Christianity usually and constantly through a subtle Protestant lens. Now, this video is not intended to go into the New Age. I'm really just trying to talk about subtle, often unnoticed effects of the general Anglo-American Protestant culture, or the formerly Protestant culture of the Anglosphere. I should say here, of course, that Ireland, until very recently, has been the one exception. Ireland was not Protestant. So I'm really talking about places like England, America that I've lived in, but also, I imagine Australia, Canada, New Zealand. Ireland, until recently, has been the exception. But now, tragically, Ireland is sort of awash in English and American culture, and even the Irish, the younger generations of Irish, are beginning to see the world through this Anglo-American lens, and I'm very concerned about that, but that's a subject for another video. But the world begins to look so different if you're an Anglo-American like me, who's been given an unusual grace, and that's the grace of really living outside the Anglo-American world. I don't know why I've been given this grace, but I have. I've lived, not only in Ireland, but France, Spain. For a while I was also in Germany and Switzerland. And when you live in those countries, when you're given the grace of that, you see things that are very different from what we get in the Anglosphere. So, for example, the French talk about something they call GAFA. It's an acronym. G-A-F-A. Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon. The French are very conscious, compared to the Irish, I would say, of how much American cultural imperialism is taking over their country. I'm frightened that's even going to be controversial if I say that. And yet it's a common perspective. Outside the Anglosphere, this is what many people in European cultures feel. And there's reasons why they would feel it. I'll give you another little story I remember from living in Spain. In Spain, I was actually living in fairly close contact with a wide community of English people who were expatriates there, living in the south of Spain. And it was Holy Week. Now, in Spain, you always know it's Easter. These days in England, people might hardly know it's Easter at all. Really, they might hardly know at all if they were in the secular culture. It's so different in Spain. Spain has these amazing processions over Holy Week, these floats, these parades, these incredible, extraordinary processions all over the country. You know it's Holy Week in Spain. And I recall reading this little British magazine while I was in Spain, English-speaking magazine, and they had something like a poll in it. And the poll had this question, and it went something like this: is Spain still different? And it was right after Holy Week, and the impression I got from the article anyway is that all kinds of English people were sort of commenting and saying, it felt like this to me: my goodness, Spain is really different. It's Catholic here. As though they weren't really registering it completely. That was the feeling I had reading all this. And moreover, the way the question was put, is Spain still different, is that there was an implication there. Different from what? Well, it meant different from the dominant Anglo-American culture. And the word still, like there's a sort of subtext that you experience there that the Spanish are rightly concerned about, the French are rightly concerned about it. They feel, coming from the English populations, the American populations, something like this: when are the French going to be more like us? When are the Spanish going to be more like us? I think of that old Henry Higgins film, My Fair Lady. Why can't a woman be more like a man? There's a feeling that they have in those countries that somehow the dominant Anglo-American culture is saying, why can't you be more like us? Why can't you learn English? Why do you have these incredible Holy Week processions? At least these are feelings that I picked up living in France and Spain. But yeah, I'm just trying to give you examples. So I gave you the example of that Wikipedia article speaking about Catholicism was once the mainstream church in the world, but now it isn't, apparently, according to this Wikipedia article. That's a mistake that no Frenchman would ever make, no Spaniard would ever make, no Italian would ever make, no Polish person would ever make, no Portuguese. It's very much the kind of subtle mistake that people in the formerly Protestant Anglo-American world can make. Now, it's also a mistake that the great Hilaire Belloc would never make. And here's where I want to start talking about Belloc from this particular angle: his vivid understanding of the Protestant nature of almost the entire Anglosphere, Ireland accepted. Now, in other videos, I'm going to speak about him from other angles because he's such an important inspiration to me, like almost no other apart from Valentin Tomberg, as I've said before, and I think his legacy is so rich, and I think his vision is so acute. But he really saw the things that I'm trying to talk about here, and he saw them much more acutely than I see them. Now, partly that's because his mind is far more brilliant than my mind is, but it's also because he had really quite a unique destiny, which allowed him to sort of see England and America from the outside. Let me give you a little bit about his life, and you'll see what I mean, I think, by this destiny that gives him this particular vision. So, Belloc was born in 1870. He was born in France, near Paris, of a French father and an English mother. She was a convert. And he didn't actually end up living in France very long, because Prussia invaded France in 1870, and as a small baby he was driven out. This was to result in a lifelong kind of animus against Prussia that so many French of the 19th century had, but that's another story. A grave story. But as a result, Belloc grew up in both England and France, because after the war with Prussia ended, he was able to come back from England and spend every summer in France. and grew up speaking French fluently with the French schoolchildren around him. Moreover, he became very deeply attached to France. He wanted to find a way to live in France, so he went to school there for a bit, and he also joined the French army because he wanted French citizenship and not British citizenship. And at this time in France, that he was spending so much time there, but in both countries, again, England and France, but the 1870s, the 1880s, this was the time of this rich Catholic counter-revolutionary culture in France that was fighting the revolution, that was fighting the French Republic. I've spoken about it in other videos where I've spoken about gestures like wanting to put the Sacred Heart on the French tricolour, or wanting to, the millions and millions of people that contributed to build the Sacré-Cœur de Montmartre in Paris in reparation for the sins of the Revolution. This was all going on in France at the time that Belloc was growing up. So Belloc would have witnessed, growing up between France and England, in France he would have seen this mighty Catholic counter-revolutionary culture that I've talked about before and that I'll certainly be coming back to, whereas in England he would have seen a Catholicism that was very, very, very feeble by comparison. And his whole life, I think, is actually shaped by that dichotomy, by seeing the vibrancy of French Catholicism and by feeling what for him, I think in so many ways, was a wasteland, being in Protestant England. That's how it felt to him. You read his letters and that gets clearer and clearer. Now, also, Belloc married an American wife. She was Irish-American, but she was first-generation American. And all that also gave him a whole kind of insight into America. He actually tramped right across America from the East Coast to the West Coast to find his Irish-American wife in California. And actually Belloc was something of a super tramp. He actually tramped all around Europe. There's a famous book, The Path to Rome, where he walks from the Alsace on the French-German border to Rome. But he walked the Pyrenees, he walked across Spain. All his life, he traveled back and forth across Europe. So, although in some ways Belloc was an Englishman, in some ways through and through, very much a sort of man of the upper echelons of British society, the upper classes, he was always carrying this wider perspective. He always had the background of his French Catholicism. He always had the fact that he knew Europe so well. He was not only fluent in French, but he, from a young age understood Greek and Latin, the classical languages of Europe, and he spent so much time in all these European countries. And this gave him, I think, an insight in to English society, a way of looking at English society that was very, very, very different from most of the Englishmen of his age. In fact, it was a way of looking at English society that actually often irked and annoyed and made the English angry. I'll just give you one example of something that was very contentious about Belloc. It's something that some people are going to find contentious about me as well. Belloc really felt, looking at the Protestant society that he saw in England and also in America, how much its Calvinism, its Protestant basis, had led to the extremes of capitalism that you found in the then reigning British Empire, and which I would argue you see in the American Empire today. And it concerned him. I think his heart was really wrung with pain about the plight of the poor that he saw as a result. And his experience of France was really very different. He saw that the French we're not so ground down by capitalism. Again, I want to make a point. By capitalism, by critiquing capitalism as I am here now, along with Belloc and along with Chesterton, who were great critics of capitalism, I am not meaning to criticize free enterprise. As I've said in other videos, I would see, along with Belloc and along with Chesterton, certainly, that capitalism is the enemy of free enterprise. I think we're in danger of losing an understanding of what capitalism is. Capitalism is a system arising principally out of Calvinist Protestant Europe in the 17th century, mainly Holland and England, that emphasized usury, that emphasized the greatest possible profit, that created a process where there were large concentrations of wealth in hands that had never before had them, large concentrations of capital. And the British Empire on which famously, or infamously if you like, the sun never set, was like the world's first most incredible manifestation of capitalism, the power of capitalism that Belloc and Chesterton were both so opposed to. So, yeah, that's another whole topic. It's a whole topic that I want to go into in other videos. My point really now is that none of this really made Belloc very popular in England, to sort of be suggesting that Catholic Europe actually had all kinds of qualities that Protestant England didn't have. Because Belloc saw that the Protestant English of his age really looked down on Catholic Europe. They saw them as backwards. They certainly saw the Irish as sort of primitive and backwards, but also the rest of Europe. The rest of Europe were not so good at capitalism. And he understood from the outside this profound split in Europe between the Protestant psychology that dominated in England, dominated in Holland, dominated in Prussia, and the Catholic mentality that existed across Ireland and southern Latin Europe. What can I say? I think I'm going to insert something personal here. When I was living in France and Spain, I hadn't yet read any Belloc. It's only something that's happened since. So now I'm looking back at what Belloc said 80 to 100 years ago, and I'm actually shocked by how relevant it still seems to me today. I really think the man had an acute vision, enormous powers of analysis, and an original mind that wasn't just going to go with the flow, and he saw things out of the box. And I'm finding in all of his controversy deep insights for Europe and the Anglosphere. They're relevant to things like Brexit, which I'll maybe be going into in another video. So all of that is more for another time. But I think what I also want to touch on is that Belloc, as I've said, he was very familiar with that passionate French Catholicism that he grew up with, the passionate counter-revolutionary Catholicism. And what he found in England was something very, very different. He found a Catholicism that was tepid, that was weak, that was frightened to stand up for itself. And he really felt that what he needed to do was to help English Catholics fight back, take a stand. And that's another reason why I think he's so relevant in the Anglosphere today, that he sees in the Anglosphere how much its Protestant orientation actually overwhelms Catholics, often without Catholics really realizing. Today, I would say that it's more the New Age culture that's overwhelming Catholicism in the Anglosphere, and as I suggested this earlier, I would see in so many ways that the New Age culture has arisen out not only of the Anglo-American world, but out of the Protestant world. This is a subject I want to go into in another time. But if you think just very briefly about what Protestantism did, it eliminated so much of the mystery of Christianity. So it eliminated the sacraments. It eliminated Our Lady. It eliminated the Rosary. It eliminated so very, very much of the Catholic mystery in favour of what was a very literal Protestantism. And very briefly, what I think is actually happening in the Anglosphere today is that old Protestantism is dying away. That old literalist Protestantism is dying away. But people who are hungry for the mystery are actually turning to the New Age. That's a subject for another time. What I really want to get at now is that Belloc seems to me still very relevant today as a champion of Catholic thinking, Catholic principles, Catholic culture in the Anglosphere. In fact, in so many ways, he lies at the very root of the Catholic culture of the Anglosphere. Now, that last thing that I said might actually sound contentious, might sound controversial to some people. Some people think, well, what on earth does he mean by that? I'd like to share something with you that Frank Sheed said in 1953. If you don't know who Frank Sheed was, he was one half of a publishing company called Sheed and Ward, famous English Catholic publishing company in the first half of the 20th century. A very respected English Catholic who knew Belloc and Chesterton very well. And after Belloc died, he actually said this, it's very striking. More than any other man, Belloc made the English-speaking Catholic world in which all of us live. There was Chesterton, of course, but then Belloc had so much to do with the making of Chesterton, and Chesterton not much with the making of Belloc. I'm not going to get into a controversy around Belloc and Chesterton right now. I will simply say that Chesterton is an incredibly beautiful, incredibly original mind who had all kinds of things that Belloc didn't have. Chesterton was very magnanimous and magnificent. So I'm not trying to sort of say anything about Chesterton here. I do think that he has a point that more of Belloc rubbed off on Chesterton than the other way around. But really, the key thing that I'm getting at here is more the opening line. More than any other man, Belloc made the English-speaking Catholic world in which all of us live. That is very striking. And you'll only really understand it if you really get a sense of how wiped out Catholicism was in the Anglosphere before Belloc arrived. Now, there was beginning to be a revival of Catholicism. There were one or two great literary figures. Most notably, there was Cardinal Newman, a great convert from the Anglican Church. There was also the poet Gerald Manley Hopkins. But really, before Belloc, there wasn't that much, because Catholicism had become so extinguished in the Anglosphere, in England, in everywhere throughout the English-speaking world, again, Ireland excepted. But back in that time, actually, Ireland wasn't that much English-speaking. The Irish Catholics were largely, before the famine, the great, terrible, horrific Irish famine of the 1840s, they were largely speaking Gaelic. Catholicism was really wiped out of the English-speaking world in a way that maybe we don't actually realize sufficiently. And Irish immigration began to bring it back into England, also into America. Of course, Germans and so on also brought Catholicism into America, Poles, Italians, and they started speaking English. But basically, before Belloc was born in 1870, there was really very little Catholicism in the Anglosphere. And so Belloc sort of emerges as, I would see, this kind of blazing comet, this pioneer fighting for the faith. And he institutes, in many ways, he pioneers a literary revival in England. So I think that's what Sheed is getting at when he says, more than any other man, Belloc created the English-speaking Catholic world that we all inhabit. I really feel we owe so much to Belloc, and that's part of what this video is about. I want to give tribute to the man. I not only want to give tribute, I also want to open the door to things that I'm going to talk about in future videos. So I very much hope in the future to be speaking about distributism, which was Belloc and Chesterton's answer to capitalism, also answer to socialism, because both men detested both capitalism and socialism. In the view of Chesterton and Belloc, socialism, state socialism, communism was actually like the bastard child of capitalism. It wouldn't have arisen if capitalism hadn't taken hold in Protestant Europe in the 17th century. And distributism was really about the restoration of free enterprise. So that's a big subject that I want to be discussing. I want to be discussing a lot that Belloc had to say about Catholic Europe, about Christendom. And reading these things 80, 100 years later, they're really kind of blowing me away. There's so much hidden away there. Just gems of insight. We're going to be going into all of that, I hope. But really, the whole point today is to talk about the Anglosphere and how Belloc can really give us a window onto the Anglosphere that isn't always easy to get to. As I said, I've had the grace, by the grace of God, I've been able to live in France, Spain, Germany, Switzerland, Ireland. I've been able to sort of live outside the sort of Protestant, the formerly Protestant Anglo-American world. Not everyone has that grace. Belloc really opens up and says a lot more than I can say, with a lot more lucidity than I could ever manage in these very great books that he wrote. And we're going to be actually talking about some of those books, I hope, in future videos. I want to sort of really reintroduce people to his, for me, astonishing legacy. But we're running out of time today, so those are just kind of future indications of where I'm going to be going in future videos. Or you can also read these things in my books. As I always do a little advert for my books in these videos. I have two of them. I have a little short book called The Gentle Traditionalist, which is like a little introduction to many of these things. And then I have a much bigger book called Jesu Sacratissimum that really goes into so much that Belloc was about and how Belloc was seeing Christendom. So I will just mention those books again. But I think I'm about done now. I think all I really want to say is, if you like what I'm trying to do with this new YouTube channel, I would appreciate your support by subscribing, by liking, or sharing it with friends or in groups. I noticed somebody actually shared it in a Reddit forum. Very, very grateful if you can share it. Share the videos if you like them in forums like that. Thank you. Thank you for your support for this new YouTube channel, and thank you for listening. Thank you, friends, and God bless you.